Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Ex-Monks Tribe. It's such a pleasure to have you on this episode today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for the invitation.
And Peter, you know what? I've heard about you so much, about the initiatives that you are driving in the world, the Ubiquity University that you are leading, all the other initiatives that you have taken to make this world a beautiful place. And I would like to know about where do you get all this inspiration from? How do you drive all these initiatives? How do you make sure that people are together? But before we get there, I've got a very basic question to ask you. Please share with us a childhood memory that today brings a smile on your face.
I think it would probably be a moment in the Yorkshire Dales in the north of England, which is my favorite place on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And as kids, we used to have these little plastic toy boats, and then we'd put them down the river and race them down the river, basically, and then try to catch them, before they disappeared out of sight. So, so those moments of playing in the water with the hills and stuff around and without a care in the world, essentially, that brings a smile to my face.
Yeah, I'm sure we all have certain childhood memories in our own lives that bring the smile on our face today. So, Peter, I'm just wondering, what do you think? How has your childhood crafted the person that you've become today? How has that contributed to your life and the kind of work that you are involved in today?
Yeah, that's a good question because, I was sent away to boarding school when I was 8 and stayed there till 18. That does a number of things to you. One, you don't understand why your parents abandoned you as a child. So you learn to protect yourself and survive, essentially. One of the things you do in that process is that you bottle up the emotions, because showing vulnerability and the emotional side, puts you open to bullying or any other things from kids. So you learn to basically develop a hard outer shell. And that over the years, it's interesting because when you're missing something, like say your access to the emotional side or the more sensitive side, that's the thing that you end up going on a quest for. And it's the thing that maybe touches you most when you experience it in the world. I know one of the things that as a child used to really touch me was if I ever saw or read about the suffering of animals, for example. That used to really touch me, and I didn't really know why for any particular reason. But I guess early on I developed a pretty strong sense of justice in terms of wanting to make sure people and all beings, I guess, were treated with respect, and that humans were able to be compassionate with each other and the world around them. And when I saw that not happening, then that used to make me really angry. So I got into into kind of environmental activism, well, I guess early 20s. And the trigger point was really when my mother, who was a Quaker, gave me a copy of Fritz Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful, which is a very small book, but in a few words completely reveals why the current economic system is an illusion, essentially, and is driving us down the wrong path. And that was one of those kind of wake up moments where like the veil is lifted between you and the world. And at that point I was, okay, so you mean everything that everybody suggests is normal may not actually be normal. Maybe we shouldn't just accept things as the way they are.
Yeah.
And as part of my studies, I studied French and German originally, and was doing a lot of work in theatre as well, both as an actor and a director. And I came across the work of a guy called Antonin Artaud, who's a Frenchman who was classified as insane and locked away in an asylum, but wrote extremely lucid volumes about the nature of life, society, and the nature of sanity and insanity.
Hmm.
And that also made me think, oh, so maybe what we think is sane and normal today is
Hmm.
actually pretty crazy when you stop and think about it.
Yeah.
And
And
maybe sometimes it's the people we see as insane who are the ones who are seeing most clearly
Hmm.
what is actually going on.
And he was in an asylum.
Yeah, so he was locked away for being insane,
Hmm.
ultimately. But
Hmm.
his writings are, he both wrote plays and just lots of text, more kind of stream of consciousness stuff,
Hmm.
but very lucid, on one level. And that was another thing that made me kind of sit up and think, I guess, woke my critical mind in terms of just, starting to question the assumptions of the world around us and what our leaders take to be the norm, and what most people take to be the norm as well.
Yeah. And what was that thought process that you were going through when you were actually looking at all these assumptions? And on one hand, the world is following those assumptions. On the other hand, you as a teenager started to question all these assumptions. And what were those new thoughts or new assumptions that you were building for yourself that led you to do what you're doing today?
I guess part it was a thought process, but it was probably driven also by more of an emotional process.
Hmm.
That was, I guess, often as kind of teens and early 20s, we are in a student kind of world. We're in a bit of a rebellious mindset that we're questioning the status quo,
Yeah.
believing that we have the answers for how it all should be. So I guess I was going through that kind of process, but somewhere I guess that feeling of a deep value, I guess, around the respect for life and how
Hmm.
people should be treating each other, animals, the rest of life with respect was probably driving it underneath. And then as I saw revealed how the current economic systems, the current social systems seemed not to be built on that assumption,
Hmm.
but really built on a model that was around generating as much profit as possible, financial profit as possible for people, then, I guess that was that fed my rebellious fire, as it were, and there was something I could fight against and something I could fight for, and
Hmm.
somehow that gave meaning to my life in those early days. Even though later on I began to see the polarization as being too extreme,
Hmm.
in those days it gave me, I guess, a sense of purpose.
Yeah. In fact, the whole episode, the whole conversations that we get into with our guest is primarily to help us understand that how do people come to a conclusion that this is my purpose, right? Or this is the cause that I really care for. Now, Peter, you are a global social activist. You are an author. You are a teacher. You are a coach and a facilitator. You're a social entrepreneur. You are involved in education as well. There's so many initiatives that you really care for, and the reason that you are involved is what we call as the humanity rising. Now, if you look at the common thread, somewhere or the other, you are connected to the very basic of an individual, that is humanity. Now, I'm just curious, what were those defining moments in your life that actually helped you to come closer to something that you really care for, and that actually led you to start Ubiquity University?
Well, one would have been my mother giving me that book, clearly. The next one, the next one would have been I spent a year in Paris working with a theatre company with an Iranian director who'd worked with a British director called Peter Brook, who's a very well-known theatre
Hmm.
director. And it was very raw theatre in terms of you spent like 5 hours an evening, 5 days, 6 days a week, training your body first, like a couple of hours of real physical work, and then working on improvisation, essentially. And I remember waking up one morning, a few months down the line, suddenly feeling like, wow, I was really for the first time kind of conscious of and in my body properly. And that was a big step.
Hmm.
And that whole experience of the process of creativity and the process
Beautiful.
of trying to stay really close to what was true in the moment, which is what the whole improvisation world gives you.
Hmm.
That was an important step. But then at the same time, I was studying kind of global economics and continuing my inquiry into the the state of the world and why things were the way they were. And at the end of that year in Paris, I asked myself the question, did I think theatre could change the world? And at that point, I said no. And so my commitment was to try to, make a positive difference somehow. And I was interested in development world and the kind of injustices that I saw going on as the developed countries impose their model on developing countries, forcing them through the debt systems and everything else to adopt an economic and social model that I saw as being fundamentally flawed. But I felt to be able to work in that area with any authenticity, I needed to have experienced it myself. So I signed up for something called voluntary service overseas, VSO, and I went to Ghana. And I had spent a year. It would normally have been 2. I'll tell you why it was only a year, in a village in northern Ghana, without running water, without electricity, teaching a class of 100 kids English with 5 textbooks. And so I kind of threw the normal teaching method out the window and just started to get them interacting with each other and getting used to learning to think by themselves. Rather than what they were being taught, which was, the teacher would write the stuff on the blackboard, like adjective is a word that describes a noun, and the kids would write it down in their books. And so if I asked, what is an adjective, hands would go up, master, master, master. An adjective is a word that describes a noun. And, okay, very good. And if I wrote a sentence on the board which had an adjective and a noun in it and said, okay, which word's the adjective, they couldn't tell me. Because they just learned to memorize it by rote.
Yeah.
They'd not learned to internalize what it actually meant. Right. So anyway, so I was in Ghana for a year, and I'd shipped out a box full of books that included some of the early green politics stuff from Jonathan Porritt, but also included Gurdjieff. It's kind of the more spiritual, esoteric work as well. So there I was, kind of reading this stuff, doing also a distance learning course in development economics. And Ghana was going through a World Bank IMF structural adjustment program at the moment, which meant that they were having to cut funding to the education system. That was part of the deal, right? Cut public spending, boost your import, export, and et cetera, et cetera. But this school that I was working in was a boarding school because it had a huge catchment area. The kids couldn't go back home because it was hundreds of kilometers away. And so they would board at this school, and not everybody had the money to pay the fees. So they would maybe pay in chickens, or they'd pay, goats or whatever. But as the government enforced the cost reduction in education, the school was running out of money. So it had to enforce the payment of school fees, and said, look, if you don't pay your school fees, then you won't be allowed in the dining hall, which would have meant that the kids would have had to go home, because they would have been able to feed themselves.
Yeah.
So that would have been the end of their education. And the day that they enforced that rule, a bunch of the kids went into town and they got drunk and they got stoned, and they came back and they burnt down the school. So there I was in the middle of rural Ghana with a burnt down school, but I could see the chain of events from somebody taking a decision about a macroeconomic model in Washington, and boom, 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 down to the fact that this explosion on the ground. And that was a turning point for me. That made me, I could have gone to another school and had my second year, but I was like, it's not my purpose to be clearing up the mess. My purpose is to be trying to get to the cause. So that was kind of where I embarked, I guess, on a mission to change the whole global economic system.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So rather than
was it. And so I did a master's degree in human ecology after that, which gave me some of the context for that work. Yeah. And I'd say if I think of one other kind of key defining moment, while I was waiting for that master's degree, I spent 6 months in London being a kind of environmental activist, closing down roads and occupying places and stuff like that. But I was doing voluntary work for the Tibet support group at that point. And I remember we had a Tibetan monk come in who had escaped over the Alps. Oh, not over the Alps, over the Himalayas. And he came in and he didn't have any teeth. because he'd been essentially tortured by the Chinese, and they put electric rods in his mouth, and so all his teeth fell out. And then he came in without any teeth, but with a big smile. And then we sent him to the dentist to get new teeth. And I can still remember the moment he walked back in the office and opened the door and gave us this big smile. He had a new set of teeth. And, we were taking him around, talking to ministers and exposing really what was going on between the Chinese and Tibetans. But there was something about the quality of his presence and what he had achieved in terms of like how he managed to get across the mountains in that way and escape despite and everything that he'd been through, that I think left a big impression on me as well. Yeah, so I guess those are a few of the spotlights. And somehow my life has always been a combination of, on the one hand, wanting to be hands-on, trying to make a difference and doing the work.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, wanting to teach about what I'm learning. So I couldn't just be somehow that teaching has to be embedded in experience. If I was just having the experience, it would feel a bit selfish because then I wasn't communicating what I was learning to anybody else. So it's always been a kind of combination. And the other day I was thinking, if I was to summarize my like roles in terms of what would it come down to? And I ended up saying, well, I think I'm a philosopher, a teacher, and a social entrepreneur. And the kind of the philosopher in a way is the bit that thinks about the experience, tries to draw something from it and then turn it into the teacher who can then go and communicate it, as it were. But it has to be experience, as well.
And I think that's one of the USP of the Ubiquity University and the way you teach students there globally. Is my understanding right?
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny you should make that link because yes, indeed, when I was the one who came up with the pedagogy, the core pedagogy for Ubiquity. And it was rooted in integral theory as well. But, as we talk about it now, I also see how it's really rooted in a way that kind of commitment that I have somehow. And what we were thinking was if we were to create a university education anew, given what's needed in the world today, given the technology possibilities, etc., but also our understanding of human development, how would we do that? And so what I proposed was that the students get 1/3 of their credits for knowledge-based learning, which is what you normally get 100% for in traditional university.
Yeah.
And then you get 1/3 for personal development, what we call self-mastery. So more the interior qualities, your emotional intelligence and things like that. And then they get 1/3 of their credits for a hands-on project, which is contributing in some way to the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. And that often, some study programs traditionally have a capstone project, as they call it, that they do at the end. But what I was committed to was to making sure that people are trying to make the change from the beginning of their studies, so that because what happens is as you engage in trying to affect change in your community or your organization or start your own business or whatever it is, you realize why it is you have to learn certain things. Right? And then you also bump up against yourself and your own limitations. So it gives a context for your learning and your personal development. Otherwise, that just happens in a vacuum. And so, yeah, that very much reflects, I guess, my own pathway, which is a feeling that you can't teach in an abstract way. You have to teach from experience somehow. And so also you need to learn from experience. And so very much an action learning context where ultimately the mission is to equip people with the mindset, tool set, skill set to make a positive difference in the world. Do that, they need to work on themselves, they need to learn stuff, and they need to practice.
So there are 3 parts to that, right? What we call as the explore, equip, and engage. 1/3 is what you really learn, what in most of the colleges, most of the schools, they teach you, the what part of it. The second one is what we call as the equip part of it. What you talk about the self-mastery. How can you learn the skills which are really relevant to you in today's competitive VUCA world when you talk about emotional intelligence, how to collaborate, how to communicate, and what we call as the soft skills. And the third one is the impact that you are creating on the world, the social entrepreneurship, the implementation on the day-to-day basis. Is my understanding right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And yes, the what in terms of the explore, which is the knowledge-based learning. That
Hmm.
is what most colleges do, but also the content of that I think that we offer is quite different because it's focused on, trying to lift the veil, as it
Hmm.
were, between engaging the critical thinking, getting people to think about, our current economic systems or the way we work with natural resources, the
Hmm.
way we work with each other, the way violence and conflict. So it's the content is, I'd say, pretty revolutionary as well.
Hmm.
So there is stuff we need to learn with our minds. We actually need to learn to think critically about the current system,
Yeah.
but also to understand what the design principles need to be for
Hmm.
creating a positive future.
Yeah. So, Peter, I'm very curious. How did you come up with this name called ubiquity?
Yeah, I can't claim I came up with that. That was actually Paul Taylor, who was our first chief marketing officer, and he was just walking down the beach one day. He lives in Florida. He
Hmm.
was walking down the beach, and he looked at the ocean, and he said, "What should we call this thing?"
Hmm.
And he just got this word, ubiquity, given to him.
Hmm. Beautiful.
So I'd say, yeah, it came out of the field, as it were. We were working on this thing, and but we didn't have a name for it, and so
Hmm.
there was a tension. So there was a pattern of what it was we were creating, and so when he just opened up and asked, there it was. And then we thought, oh, how beautiful. Ubiquity, means everywhere at the same time.
Hmm.
So being online meant it was available everywhere, and people could be
Hmm.
engaging at any time. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
anytime, anywhere.
And if you look at your journey from where you started, where you were going through challenging the assumptions of the world and finding your own meaning, to where you are today, where Ubiquity University is very well known globally, right? And people are getting a lot of value. If you look at the kind of testimonials that people have given, the kind of value that people get, people drive out of that. And it's like phenomenal. And you've got so many change makers enrolled for that, right? If you look at this journey, so on one hand, we have got the Harvards and the Stanfords and the INSEADs of the world, the Ivy League colleges.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, you have got the very unconventional way of learning and teaching. I'm sure the path would not have been very easy. So, what do you think? What are the major challenges that you came across, and how did you manage to stay on that path, commit to the purposeful vision that you saw for yourself and for this beautiful world?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think let's answer the second one first. So, because in a way, that's the easier one,
Yeah.
and that's what has kept the team together
Hmm.
and kept us going through all the ups and downs. Is the values-driven mission, basically,
Hmm.
that was a feeling both individually and collectively in the organization that that the world needs this right now. And for me, it's a continual questioning of, am I doing what I could be doing to have the greatest possible impact
Hmm.
in the world today? And as I look at the potentiality of ubiquity in terms of being able to provide both lifelong learning, but also degreed education
Hmm.
globally to, the literally tens of millions of young people out there who are qualified, come out of secondary education, qualified to go into higher education, but can't get in just because of a lack of infrastructure,
Hmm.
right? Then there's a real, serious impact that we could be having in terms of both the, enabling people to think in a new way, but also to support them to develop their own projects or develop their own businesses that are aligned with, the what's needed in the world,
Hmm.
basically. So it's I guess making sure we stay continually connected to. I'm just looking. Funny, I have on the wall here are like 7 key principles,
Hmm.
which are the kind of some of the glue that hold it together. And the first one says alignment. We
Hmm.
continually presence our vision, mission, and principles, and that's key,
Hmm.
right? The why we're doing what we're doing
Yeah.
is what keeps us going. And so, yeah, there've been various challenges along the way, from obviously as a startup, being able to convince investors to put money into
Hmm.
a company that's so far ahead and on the leading edge, as it were. When we started this 7-8 years ago, and we're talking about, a social learning platform. There were no learning platforms that had community stuff on them. They were these kind of blackboards of the world that just delivered dry content in a very kind of techie environment. So we had to iterate 3 different social learning platforms because we were having to build an experiment with our own. Now we've ended up with the Ubiverse, which is fantastic. You've got the whole competency-based education that was, that was still on the fringes back then. Now, recently, the U.S. Department of Education have said they need to revisit the whole accreditation system to take into account competency-based education. But basically, rather than the credit hour model that says you've got to spend a certain amount of time in education, focuses on what is it you can show that you can do. Yeah. Which means that you can get recognition for skills you develop through any part of your life. So it's not just about, right? So it takes education out of the 3 or 4 years, you might spend in education, and says it's a lifelong learning process. So it radically disrupts the whole idea of, you go to college or whatever, and then you go to work. You have your education, then you have your work. No, the world's changing so fast that we've got to keep learning as we go. So evolving the skills and competencies we need to fit a rapidly changing world is going to be key. If you just have a theoretical education for 4 years, by the time you've left, the world has changed and your education's out of date. So, but that was fairly radical back then, and people are starting to catch up now. So it was both in terms of investors and also explaining to students what we meant by it. When you're right on the leading edge, it's challenging because people haven't thought the thought before. And then I guess dealing with things like accreditation bodies, which are really the biggest block to innovation in higher education that's out there. So you can probably hear the school bell outside. I continually stay grounded by being connected to education here as the primary school. It's just outside my window.
I can hear a few bells.
You can hear the bells, yeah. So they just the kids walk around like shaking the bell, which is nice. Yeah, where when we laid out, we'd done the research about what employers were asking for, like IBM CEO study, I think it was 2011 or something, said hypercomplexity is the biggest challenge. So that was a new word they came up with. They're not just saying complex, they're saying hypercomplex. And what does that tell you? It tells you that these 1,700 CEOs they interviewed don't have a clue about how to navigate this rapidly changing world. And what they were saying were needed were these soft skills, this communication, collaboration. And they said they weren't getting them from the current business schools, which is why they weren't able to navigate this complexity. So we'd done that research. We looked at the state of the world. We'd done the research into what students were actually asking for. And when we laid that out to the Californian accreditors, said, this is what we're going to do. They said, you can't do that. So we were kind of, okay, either we tone down what we're trying to offer to fit the current system, or we exit the current system and find another way of being able to deliver the education that we know is the education of the future.
And that's a huge challenge.
Yeah. So we bailed out of the California system, and we found a accreditation body in the UK that's approved by the British government for accrediting distance learning, which means you can cross boundaries, basically learn across all the different geographic boundaries. And so there we were able to kind of liberate ourselves from the old accreditation bodies and find one that gave us the space to do what everybody was saying was needed. But those are the struggles, when you're really trying to innovate and you're on the leading edge. You've got the bureaucracies that are there to protect the quality of the old system. And if you don't fit them, then they don't give you the approval that enables you to, get accepted, let's say, for financial aid or whatever it is. So you have to find a way to somehow get beyond those systems, because that's what the future is calling for, and yet make sure that you are rigorous around your quality assurance and making sure you really are offering something of value. But that, for a lot of parents of potential students, that's kind of scary as well.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It's like, oh, am I going to pay for my kid, even though it's radically affordable at Ubiquity? am I going to pay for my kid to go and do a degree at this place that,
Yeah.
doesn't have a US accreditation, even though, some of them may feel that it's the right way to go.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of challenges when you're on the leading edge, is really people being bold enough to step into something that feels different, essentially, even though they may in their gut know that it's kind of what the future is holding.
Makes sense. I'm sure if you look at today's challenges as well, so there are very different kind of challenges the world is going through. So for example, COVID-19 is one of those challenges that the world is talking about. I personally feel it is the VUCA at a very different level altogether. So we have been talking about VUCA for the last 10 years, but I think this is going to take the definition of VUCA to a very different level altogether. Then we have got challenges like pollution, right? We have got everything is getting digitalized on day-to-day basis. The climate change is another big time challenge, right? The species extinction is a challenge. The forest loss is a challenge. The global warming is a challenge. The shortage of water is a challenge. And then what we are talking about, the Black Lives Matter. Now, if you look at all these challenges bundled together, what do you think? What kind of future-proof leadership is required? And what can we do on day-to-day basis when we are talking about that at a school level or at the education level, at the schools or colleges? So what do you think? What is the need of the hour today to have that future-proof leadership?
Yeah, I mean, that's what you described is really the hyper complexity that the kind of CEOs were picking up a few years ago. And I mean, the key is in this, these are times that we do actually know from the past. They're what we might call non-linear times of emergence. And what characterizes them is a radical increase in complexity and speed of change, a realization that the current solutions we have aren't adequate to the challenges that are emerging, but also a lack of knowing what those solutions are.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, that is literally that Einstein quote from, you can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created them. That the mindset that created the current systems and solutions we have is also the mindset that's created the problems we have. And so you can't solve them from those mindsets. So that means you need to get to a different place.
Yeah.
And the nature of these nonlinear changes is that we can't know from where we are what that future is. So most business schools still train you to try and predict and control. So it's like predict, make a 5-year plan, manage your way forward. Okay. But when you've got a VUCA world that's changing so quickly, you make your plan, you take the first step and your plan's out of date. So, you keep, what happens is you kind of keep going like this and reality does this.
Yeah.
And so that creates stress and tension and your plan is ultimately irrelevant.
Yeah.
So we have to find a way to dynamically steer our way forward. And really key to that at the individual level, but also at the collective level, is what we might call the ability to presence. So presencing for me means the ability to be able to really find some stillness in yourself and collectively, not get caught up in the maelstrom and the whirlwind of everything going around and collapsing and the chaos. Because funnily enough, that the Greek word for chaos originally doesn't mean lots of stuff falling apart. It actually means the pattern that for the new. So when we do quiet ourselves and we enable us to access our more intuitive knowing and seeing rather than just our intellectual, then we begin to get a feeling for the pattern of the new. But the nature of the mind and the intellect is that it's related to the past, because things we know, I mean, if we know them, then they're related to the past, right? So we have to get into a space of accepting that we can't know like what the future is going to be. And when we do that, it enables us to quieten our intellectual mind and provide space for our more intuitive knowing that is more right brain, that we know can start to pick up information that is more, in quantum sense, we'd say probabilities in the field. Right? That's not something you can access with your rational mind. You access it by going inside yourself, quietening yourself down. And that's why things like mindfulness and stuff and those kind of practices are so important. So individually, that's critical, or we just get burned out, basically. Because if you try to, it's like if you imagine a storm and the eye at the center of the storm. If you try to grab hold of the whirlwind swirling around it, you just get completely pulled off your center and it'll burn you out. So what we have to do is get into the center of the storm, allow ourselves not to be fearful about the storm raging around us, because it'll trigger all sorts of stuff, because of course we've grown up in a world and been taught to think in certain ways that are now being radically challenged by that all falling apart. And so that's going to trigger all sorts of fear in ourselves, all sorts of contraction in ourselves. So we've got to do our own inner work of noticing, oh, there's that fear, hello, fear. Okay, I wonder what that's attached to, and if we can create that mindful state where we're not getting attached to things that we thought were true, which is easier said than done.
Yeah.
But that's a practice, and that's why some kind of personal development practice is absolutely essential, because that's what enables us to let go of the stuff that's attached to the past, relax and come into our center, and therefore be open to the stuff that's coming in that you can't grasp with your rational mind. You can only feel with your intuitive mind.
Yeah.
And so there's that practice individually, and there's then that practice collectively, both as a culture in an organization, where you have to really curate the resilience in the fabric of the relationships. So if, chaos bursts out, like with COVID, and the individuals contract into their own fear, then you lose relationship, because everybody contracts. The moment that you relax again, you kind of connect again, and then you can access the collective intelligence that everybody can lean into. But you can only access that and therefore collectively present something, if you've got that mindfulness. And I'd say, if you've got enough people in an organization who can do that, then you can lift the others, even though they might not have done that personal practice themselves. What will happen is you'll give them a state experience of a new state of consciousness, and that'll trigger them to develop their stages of development to be able to naturally access the states themselves. So, and then you've got to find, that's the culture, and then you've actually got to find the organizational systems, structures, and processes to support that kind of culture, which is why, more recently practices like holacracy have emerged. It's really, I see as an organizational practice that helps you to presence and dynamically steer through a chaotic period.
This is so beautiful, so well articulated and explained, Peter. And isn't this so beautiful? I asked about the future-proof leadership, and what we are talking about is something like being silent, getting into the mindfulness space and holding the space in that stone, or being present here and now. And that's exactly what our ancestors have been talking about. If you look at all the past civilizations, that's they have been talking about. And as I'm just listening to you, I find there's a beautiful connection between the past and the future, and they're so well interrelated. It's so beautiful. Now, we have got limited time now, but I would love to hear, what are your thoughts? How is past related to the future?
Very, very quickly on that. If you look at the kind of developmental models of human psychology, individual and collectively, over time, for example, things like spiral dynamics, that describes, let's say, 8 phases of development that we go through. And they're similar to, Claire Graves, who's developed it, it was around the same time as Maslow and developed the pyramid, And just as a point of interest, Claire Graves, they disagreed for a while, because Graves said it's an open-ended system. It's not a closed pyramid, because each time we solve a set of problems, it creates new challenges we have to solve again. And at the end of his lifetime, Maslow actually agreed it was an open-ended system, not a closed system. So basically what happened you look at the first 2 phases of our collective development, and they're around survival and safety. And they were the times where we were living more in hunter-gathering communities and tribes. And in that phase of our collective development, it was pre-rational. Okay, it's really important. We weren't thinking rationally. We were feeling instinctively. Okay, and when we were feeling instinctively, our direct experience was that we were one with the earth and all of life around us. Right, and we saw different dimensions of reality, but we weren't it wasn't a rational thought, it was a direct experience. And so we were very embodied, and we were very grounded in our context. And then what happened, particularly in the West, is that in the next stage of development, and this happens individually as well, by the way, those first two stages are what you see in a young baby child who really does experience themselves as one with the mother. They don't experience themselves as separate. Is that at some point the sense of separate self emerges. We become aware of, oh, look, I'm me, and there's the world around me. Yeah, and that's what in psychology you would call the ego.
Yes.
In its healthy sense, which is the sense of me, sense of separate self. And in the West, when that happened collectively, for some strange reason, if you have healthy development, when you move from one stage to the other, you need to differentiate from the past stage to be able to get some distance from it to allow the new stage to form, right? But then what you do is you wrap in the past stages because they're the foundation, as it were, upon which the next stage rests. And a healthy development like that would be transcending, but including the previous phases. What happened in the West is that we transcended, but we repressed those earlier precognitive phases out of some kind of fear of wildness, of wilderness, of nature, ultimately of the feminine. And everything that was related to the body, to the earth, we ended up depicting as evil and dirty. So we had to somehow, and what happened was then the traditional religions came on top of that and put truth outside of the world in the God of that religion, whatever that religion was. And that was why in the West we had this awful witch burning time, which was really symbolic for us being so afraid of wildness and nature that when people had natural access to that we basically wanted to try and eradicate them from the face of the earth because we were so fearful internally. And so that we've got a collective trauma in the West where we transcended and repressed relationship to earth, relationship to body, relationship to the feminine. We cut ourselves off at the neck and we emphasized the head. Essentially, we rationalized everything. And that is, in my opinion, the core reason that we've been able to do what we've done to the earth. Yeah. Because we've forgotten that we are the earth, which is such a ridiculous thing to forget. I mean, you imagine an alien looking down at the earth and they see the earth, and that includes human beings, right? We're part of Gaia's system. We are actually Gaia's experiment in self-awareness. Yeah. She's tried to see what would happen if I actually enabled someone to develop this self-awareness, if part of myself could develop this self-awareness. And so what happened in the West, which then became then we developed all this stuff in the world around us, this material stuff, to compensate for that trauma and that lack in ourselves. Yeah. Deep inside, a lot of Western civilization is grounded in fear, essentially. Yeah. You see, because what those early containers give you is a sense of rest and a sense of belonging and a sense of safety. And what do we see when we look at the West? We see craziness, trying to get faster and faster, develop more and more stuff out there to try to compensate for a lack of wholeness in here. And so that when I talked about rest and mindfulness and quiet, what you see in these developmental models is the next four systems. You could say that those, if you take a kind of Eastern perspective, those first two systems were yin-based. Their fundamental assumption was interconnectedness. Makes sense. And then the next few stages of development from the into being kind of feudal empires, into the religions and the emergence of the state, into the free market economy kind of world, and then even into the postmodern sense of self, where the ultimate truth is we're all separate from each other, have our own truths, and you're not allowed to criticize anyone else's truth. Right? Yeah, that's the ultimate, actually, in individuality. That they're all yang-based systems that are focused on separation and difference and distinction between things. Yeah. And now what's happening as we come into these seventh and eighth systems and these developmental models is that they're grounded again in a search for interconnectedness. And so what we're having to do is, in my opinion, to be able to get access to that intuitive knowing, is we have to heal the separation that happened when we moved from the precognitive, instinctive feeling of interconnectedness to that cognitive, rational separation. We have to heal and integrate again. And only when we do that will we be able to come to rest, and will we be able to get access to the information and the knowing that will enable us to get the solutions we need to the current problems.
Makes sense. Makes so much sense. Yeah.
So that's the whole thing I developed called Volution theory. Which
Volution theory. I would love to get into another conversation around Volution theory for sure. Because while I was listening to you, it reminded me that my conversation with Marilyn Hamilton, where she spoke about that how human beings are the reflective organ of Earth and the Gaia that we have been talking about. At the same time, when I was talking to Richard Barrett, what he was talking about, the different level of consciousness, the need of the hour is humanity awareness and Earth awareness. And I think when I'm listening to you, that's exactly what you're talking about, that how we need to go back and get ourselves grounded into the source we are coming from.
Yeah.
So Peter, thank you so much. I think that is a beautiful conversation I had with you. And I'm reflecting on how can I contribute to something that I really care for. The way you, having gone through all the challenges that you went through, and yet you took a call that you are going to stand for something that you really care for, irrespective of the challenges that you face. Now, what do you wish you knew at an age of 21?
I don't think I would have wanted to know more than I knew then. In a way, if you look back, I'm here now because of what happened back then.
Yeah.
So if I knew something then that I know now, then I would have become somebody different. So
yeah. Now, Peter, help me understand. Now, look back. And if you look at, for all the wisdom that you have been able to accumulate for yourself, for all the learnings that you have been able to pick up for yourself, for all the so-called successes and the so-called failures, the yin and the yangs of the world, what do you know for sure with 100% certainty today that you would like to share with our audience?
In a way, the only thing I know for sure is that nothing's for sure. They say change is the only certainty, right? And I get, well, maybe if there was one thing, it's in that not knowing and uncertainty, is if you're aligned really with something that you feel in your heart is your work to do, then as long as we keep following that, and then trust is really important. Trust that life will organize itself around your passion, essentially, as if that passion is connected to something that's needed in the bigger whole. Then we don't need to know how it's going to work out. That'll reveal itself. But we just need to trust that that's the path we have to walk it one step at a time, and just pay attention to how the synchronicity works, how things come onto our path, how life recognizes that resonance from our heart, and and supports us to achieve our purpose.
Thank you so much, Peter. And this reminds me of one of your favorite quote that we spoke about during our initial few conversations, where you said, it's a quote by Aristotle, where you said, where your talents meet the needs of the world, therein lies your vocation.
That's it.
So I think that really summarizes what you just spoke about. Thank you so much, Peter, for being with us on this conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.